We've discussed before how in E-Card, big basics were for the most part depowered to the point where the focus was heavily shifted to evolution Pokemon, especially Stage 2 Pokemon. But some big basics were worth the trouble of trying to find a workaround. Like Suicune, its Hypno Wave attack was very useful against Fire-type decks. You flip a coin, and if heads, the attack does 50 damage instead of 30. If tails, the opponent's Pokemon is asleep. No matter which way your coin flip went, it was a useful attack, but the preferable outcome was going to be flipping heads and dealing 100 damage to the opposing fire type. Even in non-fire matchups, 50 damage for 3 energy is pretty okay, or same for 30 damage plus sleep, it's usable. The problem is that in order to attach the water energy that you need to use Hypno Wave, you have to first discard an energy attached to Suicune thanks to its Pokebody Pure Body. This can be annoying and completely waste your turn if you don't work around it. So the workaround for this deck is just not attaching any water energy to Suicune. More on that later. Depending on what part of the metagame cycle you're in, you're either seeing a lot of fire types to deal with steel types, you're seeing a lot of water types to deal with the fire types, you're seeing a lot of lightning types to deal with the water types, and one of the best lightning cards to deal with opposing water types is Zapdos. Zapdos is already in a bunch of decks as a 1-of or a 2-of for this reason, and you can make it work by using its Plasma attack to attach lightning energy to it, since its anti-lightning Pokebody prevents you from attaching lightning energy cards from your hand. And that is for the purpose of powering up a Lightning Storm attack, which is going to deal 60 damage for 4, but you do have a little bit of acceleration. It's still a little bit slow though, for a basic Pokemon. If only there were some way to streamline these electric type decks. The least commonly used decks in E-Card. There is, and we're going to talk about it in the deck list. How do we make Suicune and Zapdos work as big basics? How do we make an electric type deck work in E-Card? How did this deck list turn into one of my favorites to play in E-Card? Let's get into it. The first Pokemon that we're going to look at in this deck is the Water-type Chinchou, which, as you will notice, does not require any Water-type energy to attack. You can actually hit Fire types for 2 colorless, and that's going to be pretty useful sometimes. So we're going to be running 2 copies of the Water-type Chinchou, but we're also going to be running 2 copies of the electric type. It's not going to come up too often, but sometimes you are in a situation where you're going to be attacking early game with one of these Chinchou, and so depending on what your matchup is, you will have a choice of which one you would rather grab. They both have 50 HP. The electric one does utilize lightning energy, but that's fine because that is all this deck runs. This is a pure lightning deck, and those basics of course will evolve into Aquapolis Lantern, which has the iron coating Pokepower that turns all of your lightning energy into water energy until the end of the turn. That is how you get around Suicune's Pokebody. You just attach a bunch of lightning energy to it, and then when you want to attack with Hypnoblast, you use ion coating to transform those lightning energy into water energy. You also get an amazing form of energy acceleration in Electabuzz. For 1 energy draw, you search your deck for a basic energy card and attach it to Electabuzz. On turn 2, for 2 energy, you use Reflect Energy, which is not only going to deal 20 damage, but is also going to move one of the lightning energy attached to Electabuzz to one of your benched Pokemon, ideally a Suicune or a Zapdos. Ideally, you want to start every game with an Electabuzz. Not always going to happen, but it does happen enough that this deck can really start firing on all cylinders from the get-go. For as long as Electabuzz is in the active position, it's going to be powering up everything you have on your bench, giving you huge energy advantage over your opponent most of the time. 3 copies of Suicune in here to utilize that Hypnoblast attack, and then 2 copies of that Zapdos. Your particular matchup will determine which one of these you want to search out and start powering up first, but even in a neutral matchup, having a Zapdos or a Suicune fully powered on your bench on turn 4 is pretty Swiss. It's going to be pretty scary to your opponent. 1 copy of Town Volunteers just to recycle some of the key Pokemon in this deck. For those types of situations where you really want to keep continuing with a Zapdos. You know, Zapdos is very threatening to your opponent's deck, but one of them got prized, and so you just got to recycle the same one. And then we've got a pretty standard lineup of your typical search and draw. So starting with a full playset of Pokemon Fan Club, which is going to help you search out those early Chinchous, Electabuzz. It's going to be a really fast way to grab a Suicune or a Zapdos, get it onto your bench so you can start powering it up with Electabuzz. A playset of Petalum so that you can have a surefire way to get those Lanturns when you need them. Though that is a little bit of an overkill, you can shorten that down to 3 or 2. Lantern is a really solid electric type attacker in its own right, but it's really more of like a late game finisher. If you've just had it on your bench, you just keep attaching lightning energy after lightning energy, you'll be able to pull off a pretty devastating electric tackle towards the end of the game, but that's pretty situational. Your draw power is going to be coming from 3 copies each of Oak and Underground, and one of the reasons that I like this deck so much, starting with Electabuzz, you're thinning your deck every turn, pulling energy cards straight from your deck and onto the field, making it so that when you draw cards, you're drawing more of what you need. You're not getting just dead energy drops off the top of your deck. Also got 3 copies of Copycat for those situations where you really get jealous of your opponent's hand. Or, you know, sometimes your hand just gets down to a couple of cards and you don't want to use the other one, so you play the Copycat and just draw like 2 or 3 to match your opponent. It's not ideal, but draw is draw, especially when you are smoothing out your draw power a little bit with Electabuzz pulling energy straight out to thin it a little bit. Zapdos and Lantern both deal self-inflicted damage whenever they attack with their big attacks, so it's nice to have a playset of Potion in here to keep them alive as long as possible, heal off some of that self-damage so that you're not setting yourself up for easy KOs later in the game. Also got a couple copies of Full Heal in here just because special conditions are all over the place in E-Card, and it is preferable to just heal off that special condition and get right back into the same combat loop instead of, you know, trying to retreat and find some other way around it. If you've powered up a Zapdos that's in your active, you want to attack with that Zapdos as many times as possible. But there are a couple copies of Switch in here just to help move around your Pokemon that have retreat costs of 2, like Electabuzz and Zapdos. If you get to a point where your active Electabuzz has powered up your bench as much as you need for that moment, you really want to get the damage rolling, then Switch is going to be the most efficient way to get Electabuzz onto your bench and an attacker into the active position. By this point, Electabuzz has probably dealt 20, 40, maybe even 60 damage to your opponent's Pokemon using that Reflect Energy attack, and so your opponent may be stalling and not knocking out the Electabuzz because they don't want to deal with whatever the next Pokemon is. They're trying to find the cards to evolve up, to get their own setup, so that once a Suicune or a Zapdos or even a Lantern comes into the active position, they have a way to deal with it. But as long as you've got a Switch, yank that Electabuzz back to the bench and just start knocking out Pokemon. What I've found in playing this card on TCG1 is that you can really catch people off guard just because of how it interacts with the overall metagame. E-card players aren't used to dealing with electric type decks. E-card players aren't used to dealing with energy acceleration that isn't Typhlosion. The energy acceleration in this Suicune deck does play right into Typhlosion's heat up power because of course you're going to have more energy on your side of the field than your opponent because you're accelerating with Electabuzz. But that's if Typhlosion ever actually hits the field, because Suicune is pretty efficient at just knocking out Quillavas and Charmeleons and Flareons and Houndooms. It really takes playing this deck to realize how much more smoothly it runs in comparison to most of E-card. Most of the Stage 2 decks are pretty clunky, and that's okay when your entire format runs clunkily. But this deck's setup is literally just have Electabuzz in the active position and a Pokemon on the bench. The rest will fall into place just by drawing cards, and as I mentioned earlier, Electabuzz really helps smooth out your draws just by thinning your deck of those basic energy cards. And because this deck is mostly basic Pokemon, you don't have to worry about running into as many mulligans. You get to save some space in your Pokemon slots because you're not having to include 4-4-3 lines of a Pokemon just to get the Pokemon you want onto the field, which really opens up your trainer space. As I've messed around with this deck even more since recording the initial video for it, I have realized that you don't need 4 copies of Professor Elm's training method. 2 is definitely enough. What the deck needs more of is Pokemon Reversal, so that your opponent can't hide a Quilava on the bench, The deck does benefit from ramping up the aggressiveness just a little bit so that you're not just outpacing your opponent in energy and setup, you're sticking it straight to them. With Hypno Waves and Lightning Storms right where it hurts, gusting out those Pokemon that you're going to be able to hit for weakness or get those OHKOs on. Energy removal is another great option to include in here if you're wanting to cut out some more of the supporters and go more for an aggressive, disruptive kind of gameplay. This will help compete more with Alakazam, Scizor, Umbreon, and opposing Zapdos. If you are ever up against an opposing electric type deck, then your strategy is probably going to be leading with Electabuzz and powering up a Lantern, since those two Pokemon are weak to fighting instead. I'm very curious to hear what the community has to say about this deck, since this isn't considered one of the big archetypes of E-Card, but I feel like it plays as one. I think that Suicune Lantern could work its way up in the ranks. So be sure to let me know your thoughts as well as any request decks you may have for E-Card. Social media links are in the description, and I will see you next video.